Hello and welcome to the Sprint 140 review. I will give the overview. Harpreet will update us on the UI, Adam on the providers, Joe on the platform, Alberto on the API, and Jason on the developer. So this sprint we had 174 PRs merged, 188 opened, and total PRs keeps going down, which is great. So we're holding steady here, which is awesome. In terms of the bug to enhancement ratio, 60 bugs versus 50 enhancements. So definitely skewing in the right direction here as we stabilize Yansa and try to get it out the door. And here is the eye chart. That is the health of all the major repos that we're tracking. Still working on making this a graph. And with that, I turn it over to Harpreet on the UI.
Thanks, Oleg. Hello, everyone. Total of 30 UI PRs were merged during the sprint. Out of that, 18 were bug fixes and 9 enhancements. For enhancements, David converted more of provider forms to data-driven forms during the sprint. With that, over to next slide, please. In Control Explorer, when assigning conditions to a policy, a change was made to disable move left or right buttons when selection has not been made in one of the boxes to eliminate confusion and prevent transactions to the server if a selection has not been made yet. Next slide, please. Validation was implemented on field, tab, and box levels in the dialog editor. As you can see here in the screenshot, that the field is marked to be a dynamic field. So if a user did not select an entry point for this field, Save button on the model will be disabled with the hover text, such as the one here to explain why it's disabled. Similarly, the same type of validation is being done on dialog and tab levels. For example, if a label of a tab or a dialog is missing, Save button will remain disabled with the hover text. And that is all for the UI for the sprint. Over to Adam.
Thanks, Harpreet. So one bug that we found across almost all of the providers was the event catcher wasn't heartbeating until the first event was delivered. So this was causing issues when you're trying to shut down the workers before an event was delivered, that you had to be force killing them, which was not great. It also took a lot longer to shut down since you had to hit the worker starting timeout before it would actually kill it. So we basically just moved up the time when the worker is marked as started up from the event catch block up to before it started. So that fixed that up nicely. We also moved the combined refresh worker logic, where basically all of the network managers and storage managers for like Amazon and Azure, they're all refreshed by the same worker. That logic was kind of duplicated in all of the child worker classes, so we moved that up to core. So we got to delete a bunch of essentially duplicated code in the providers. Next slide. On Ansible Tower, we changed the default API version to V2, since newer Ansible Towers don't have V1 at all. And in order to add that, the users had to manually add the API V2 to the URL for it to work, because if they didn't, it would default to V1. So now you don't have to tack on the specific API version when you're adding an Ansible Tower provider. For Foreman, we made a change to create the provider record, the parent provider. When you're creating a config manager, this was necessary so that David's DDF forms would be able to work, since they have to post to the API to create the providers, and that's not possible when trying to create an actual provider record, because the provider API is actually for managers, not providers, ironically. So now you can use the nice new DDF forms for creating configuration managers. Next slide. For Google, we found that the event catcher wasn't actually parsing any of the instance information, so it wasn't linking up any events to VMs. So if you were looking at, say, power events for start-stop on GCE instances, you would see the events in the provider timeline because they had the EMS ID, but you didn't actually see the events in the instance timeline because they weren't being linked up properly. So we made the change to parse out the VM EMS ref, and that allowed the event handler to properly link events up to GCE instances. For Kubernetes and OpenShift, we fixed metrics capture for nodes. The capture parser was looking for any network metrics tied to ETH0, ETH1, ETH2 network interfaces. Newer OpenShift nodes followed the new consistent network device naming conventions, which were brought on around the time of systemd being introduced, which allow ENS, ENO, basically the name of the interface is tied to its hardware location, so it won't change when you reboot. And we were not finding any network metrics for the nodes if the network devices were named anything other than ETH something. And that was causing failures, saying, hey, we couldn't find any metrics, and so metrics capture for the whole node failed. So now we're also looking for metrics off of those different interface names. And that's it for providers. Over to Jovi.
No, I think there's more.
Oh, one more slide. Sorry, forgot about this one. Dan added guest tools collection for Overt VMs, similar to what we do for VMware. So what's nice about Overt is you can actually get a list of applications on the VM, one of which is the guest agent, but we're actually hoping to expand this to include more applications similar to what you'd be able to get from Smart State, but without having to do Smart State. So look for that in upcoming sprints. And on the VMware side, we fixed an issue with imported distributed virtual port groups. The EMS ref doesn't match the key, and so VMs weren't being linked up properly, so we got to fix that for that. And we also do not put Vim strings any longer in the provision context. So when we were in the process of provisioning and we were putting the task state and task status, those were inadvertently Vim strings, which should only exist for the VMware provider. They shouldn't, once it hits the database, they should only be standard strings. So if you had the API ask for the VM MIQ provision attribute, the API was blowing up because it didn't have the right type required, and it shouldn't have to. So we put out a fix for that, and also database migration to clean up any existing records. Now, that's it for providers. Over to Jovi.
Next slide, please.
Can you see that, Jeff?
I can see that.
There we go. Okay, so you guys were merged sprint. The highlights of which are starting with enhancements. Bill contributed one to improve some error handling in messaging by catching decode parsing errors. Nick C contributed enhancements to enable worker deployments to have resource requests and limits. And as part of this work, he also added a flag to gate worker resource constraints. In our last sprint, Alberto added OIDC support for the self-service UI appliance. And in this sprint, he expanded that support to the codified mode. Brandon made progress on an open issue to improve our Kubernetes system reconciliation loop. In this sprint, he contributed support to allow the orchestrator to be updated during reconcile, and he added reconcile functions and Zookeeper. And lastly, for enhancements, Nick C added an override for the worker image deployed by the orchestrator. The orchestrator was not able to change the actual image name for a worker image, nor were they able to deploy with anything other than the namespace and tag deployed for the orchestrator. So this enhancement provides for more flexibility by allowing one image to be replaced at a time, and allows users to specify an image ref with digest rather than just a tag. And for bugs, Nick C fixed an issue where some environment worker pods needed a bit more time to come up. He also addressed the deadlock errors seen when updating the reindexing, the MIQ workers table. And some may have encountered a strange error of bot 3 required for this module. Nick L addressed it this sprint by adding additional Python 3 module path that's required on the send-out-white-space deployments. And Jason fixed an issue where review directories are being created in Docker, and Yuri asked about the UI could be nil in the central region. And lastly, for bugs, Joe addressed on where external management systems disconnect MS workers when called from a remote server. Next slide, please. I still see, there we go. Yeah, okay, so I like to list the PRs that contribute to the build environment, because I know some in the community are working on doing their own builds. I won't go through all of these. They're just here for reference, and these are the ones that are related to our build. And that's it for the platform space. On to Alberto and the API.
Yep. Thanks, Joe. Yep. So for the API enhancements, this sprint, Libor added it's now exposing the tag description when you query the assignments in chargeback. So in this example here, we're doing a get on API chargebacks, that particular resource, and asking for assigned to. As you can see in the response shown in bold in the bottom, you'll have now the description that's being returned. And that's it for the API enhancements. Next slide, please.
Okay, on the developer side, systemd-based workers on appliances were not working. And this was a result of multiple work streams from two different people sort of colliding. And an environment variable was put in place that wasn't realized on the other side. So unfortunately, we tried to enable systemd-based workers for Yansa, but they were never working. And because of that, we're removing that feature from Yansa because it hasn't really been tested by anybody. So Yansa will use the Spawn-based workers. But on master Kasparov, we're going to be using systemd-based workers because that's now been fixed. And then the other thing to note is that manageIQ.org is now using the ManageIQ documentation's Markdown-based master branch. So the move to Markdown for master at least is done. And then we will be moving that back to the Yansa branch as well, so that Yansa will be Markdown-based. And that's it for me.
All right. That's a wrap. So thanks to all the speakers. Thanks to all the contributors, and thanks to the community for making this sprint happen. We will be back in 2 weeks to give you an overview of what we did in sprint 141. Thanks, everyone.